The bell rang with a sharp, metallic echo that sliced through the classroom, and for a brief moment, everything felt ordinary. Students shifted in their seats, notebooks snapped shut, and the low hum of teenage voices rose and fell like static. But in the third row, near the window where sunlight spilled across a scratched wooden desk, Marcus Reed sat frozen, his backpack still zipped, his pencil resting motionless between his fingers. He had been mid-sentence when the teacher's voice cut him off, loud enough to silence the entire room. "Marcus, that's enough. You talk too much." The words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like a verdict. A few students glanced back at him, some confused, others uncomfortable. Marcus blinked, unsure how asking a question about the lesson had turned into a problem. He had raised his hand. He always did. That was how learning worked. At least that was what he had believed. The teacher stood rigid at the front of the room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on him with a mixture of irritation and authority. "You've disrupted my class for the last time," she continued. "Pack your things. You're suspended." The word landed heavy, echoing in Marcus's chest long after it was spoken. Suspended, for talking, for speaking, for thinking out loud. He slowly slid his notebook into his backpack, the zipper sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. As he stood, his legs felt unsteady, not from fear, but from disbelief. No warning slip, no private conversation, just removal. Public and final. As he walked toward the door, he could feel the eyes on his back and could sense the confusion rippling through the room. He didn't look back. He didn't argue. He had learned early that arguing only made things worse. The hallway outside felt colder, emptier. The sounds of other classes bled through the walls, muffled laughter and lectures that continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something irreversible. In the administrative office, a secretary barely looked up as he was told to sit and wait. His name was typed into a system, his suspension logged with a reason so vague it felt insulting. Talking too much. Marcus stared at the words on the screen, wondering how curiosity had become misconduct. He thought of his mother, already working a double shift, of how he would have to explain this to her, how the word suspended carried a weight far heavier than its definition. He thought of the countless times he had been praised for participation in earlier grades, the teachers who once told him he had a voice that mattered. Somewhere along the way, that voice had become a problem. The principal finally emerged, delivering a rehearsed explanation about classroom order and respect, about rules and consequences, all without once asking what Marcus had actually said. No one asked why he spoke. No one asked what he was trying to understand. He was dismissed, handed a suspension notice, and told to wait outside for his ride. As he stepped onto the front steps of the school, the afternoon sun felt harsh, exposing. Students passed by, whispering, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution, as if proximity to him might somehow be dangerous. Marcus sat alone, shoulders hunched, staring at the ground, replaying the moment again and again. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really about talking. It never was. It was about being heard in a place that preferred silence from people who looked like him. What he didn't know, what no one in that building knew yet, was that his name had already appeared in files far beyond the school district, in places where voices were not just encouraged but protected. Somewhere, far from that quiet bench outside the school, his suspension had triggered a chain of attention no one there was prepared for. And while the school believed the matter was closed, the truth was only just beginning to speak. Marcus Reed's voice had always carried weight long before anyone decided it was too heavy for a classroom. He grew up in a small apartment on the east side of the city, a place where the walls were thin and the nights were loud with sirens, arguments, and the constant reminder that silence was not safety. His mother, Denise Reed, worked long hours as a nursing assistant, often leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark. She raised Marcus with one rule that mattered more than any other: never let anyone convince you that your thoughts don't matter. When Marcus was younger, he used to sit at the kitchen table while his mother studied for certification exams, asking endless questions about the human body, about why people got sick, about how systems worked and why some people seemed trapped inside them. Denise never told him to be quiet. She told him to be curious. That curiosity followed him everywhere. In elementary school, teachers described him as bright, engaged, and exceptionally verbal. He loved words. He loved how ideas connected, how one question led naturally to another. Reading wasn't just an assignment to him, it was a doorway. History books fascinated him the most, especially stories about movements, speeches, and moments when someone's voice shifted the course of events. He memorized quotes, not to recite them, but to understand how language could challenge power. By middle school, Marcus was already known as the kid who always had his hand up. He didn't interrupt, he waited, he listened, and when he spoke, it was usually to ask why something worked the way it did, or how it connected to something else. At home, he practiced debates in front of the mirror, imagining himself on stages he'd only seen online, his voice steady, confident, impossible to ignore. But as he grew older, the praise began to change shape. Compliments turned into comments. Engagement became disruption. Confidence became attitude. Teachers who didn't know him well started writing notes about him needing to learn when to stop talking. Marcus noticed the shift, even if he didn't fully understand it. He noticed that students who looked like him were corrected more quickly, watched more closely, silenced more often. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't. Speaking was how he processed the world. Silence felt like surrender. His mother saw the tension growing, but trusted the system more than she should have. She believed schools were places of protection, places that nurtured potential. When Marcus came home excited about a debate club or a mock trial opportunity, she encouraged him, proud that her son was finding his voice in a world that often tried to take it. What she didn't see were the small warnings stacking up quietly in his school file, comments that framed his intelligence as inconvenience rather than asset. Marcus sensed it though. He learned to measure his words, to count how many times he spoke in class, to lower his hand, even when his mind was racing with questions. But curiosity doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It waits. And in Marcus's case, it kept growing, sharpening itself, preparing for moments when speaking wouldn't just be encouraged, but necessary. What the school saw as a problem was the very thing that had drawn attention from places far beyond those classroom walls. Places that didn't fear his voice but valued it. To understand how Marcus Reed's voice became a disciplinary issue, you had to understand the environment that surrounded it. The school prided itself on structure, order, and test scores, a place where hallways were lined with banners celebrating compliance as much as achievement. Teachers were encouraged to maintain strict control, to keep classrooms quiet, efficient, predictable. Questions were welcome, but only the right kind, asked at the right time, in the right tone. And for students who fit neatly into expectations, that system worked just fine. But Marcus didn't fit neatly. His questions weren't disruptive in the traditional sense, but they were persistent. They challenged assumptions. They slowed the pace of lessons designed to move quickly, towards standardized answers. For some teachers, that kind of engagement felt less like enthusiasm and more like a threat to authority. His teacher, Mrs. Caldwell, had been teaching for nearly 2 decades. She believed deeply in discipline and structure, believed that classrooms needed firm boundaries to function. To her, control was synonymous with respect. She had seen students derail lessons before, had watched classrooms dissolve into chaos when one voice went unchecked. And somewhere along the line, she had learned to equate quiet with learning. Marcus's presence unsettled that balance. Each time his hand went up, each time he followed one question with another, it chipped away at her sense of order. She began to anticipate his voice before he spoke, her patience thinning with every raised hand. In staff meetings, teachers shared strategies for managing. Students like him, students described with coded language that sounded neutral but wasn't. Words like challenging, strong, willed, needs, redirection. Marcus's name came up more than once. The school's disciplinary system reinforced those perceptions. Minor infractions were logged, patterns noted, files built quietly over time. A comment here, a warning there, nothing that seemed serious on its own, but together they painted a picture of a student who was frequently disruptive. No one stopped to ask why his questions persisted or what they revealed about his intellect. The administration valued efficiency, smooth operations, the absence of conflict. A student who slowed lessons with dialogue, even thoughtful dialogue, became a problem to be managed rather than a mind to be nurtured. Mrs. Caldwell didn't see herself as biased. She saw herself as maintaining standards. But standards, when applied without reflection, often mirror the assumptions of those who enforce them. Marcus noticed how quickly his name was written on the board, how often his behavior was scrutinized compared to others. He noticed how classmates who spoke out of turn were gently reminded while he was warned publicly. Still, he tried to adapt. He waited longer before raising his hand. He rehearsed questions silently, deciding which ones were worth the risk. But the tension between curiosity and control kept tightening. The school's politics favored silence over substance, order over understanding. And in that environment, Marcus's voice, once celebrated, had slowly been recast as defiance. The decision to suspend him didn't come from a single moment of frustration. It came from a system that had already decided he was too much, too loud, too visible, too unwilling to shrink himself for the comfort of authority. The morning of the suspension unfolded like any other, ordinary enough to disguise what it would become. Marcus arrived at school early, the way he always did. Backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds tucked away before he stepped through the front doors. The halls smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paper, lockers slamming open and shut as students gathered their books. He took his seat in Mrs. Caldwell's class with the quiet determination of someone trying to stay invisible. That day, he told himself, he would keep his head down. He would listen, take notes, and speak only if absolutely necessary. The lesson began smoothly, a review of material Marcus already understood. He wrote quickly, his mind racing ahead, connecting ideas, noticing a contradiction in the example on the board. He felt the familiar urge rise, that pull to clarify, to understand fully. He resisted it at first, pressing his pencil harder into the paper. But when Mrs. Caldwell moved on without addressing the inconsistency, something inside him refused to let it go. He raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, waiting to be acknowledged. She sighed before even calling on him, a sound heavy with impatience. "Yes, Marcus," she said, already bracing herself. He spoke calmly, respectfully, pointing out the discrepancy and asking for clarification. The room went still. For a brief moment, It felt like the old days, like learning was about dialogue. Then Mrs. Caldwell's expression hardened. "We're not doing this today," she said sharply. "You're talking too much again." Marcus tried to respond, to explain that he was only asking about the lesson, but she cut him off. Her voice rose, firm and final. "That's enough. Pack your things." The class watched in stunned silence as Marcus processed what was happening. "You're suspended," she added, the word ringing louder than the bell ever could. Marcus's face burned, not from guilt, but from humiliation. He moved slowly, aware of every sound, every movement amplified by the tension in the room. As he zipped his backpack, he caught the eye of a classmate who looked confused, almost apologetic. No one spoke. When he stood and walked toward the door, his steps felt heavy, each one carrying the weight of a decision he hadn't made. In the hallway, the noise of the school rushed back in, indifferent and relentless. He was escorted to the office, where the procedure unfolded with mechanical precision. Forms were printed, reasons were typed. No one asked for his side of the story. Talking too much was entered as the cause, reduced to a few words that failed to capture the moment's complexity. Marcus sat in a plastic chair, staring at the floor, listening to the muffled voices behind closed doors. When the principal finally addressed him, it was with a rehearsed tone, citing policy and classroom management, emphasizing respect without acknowledging understanding. Marcus nodded, not because he agreed, but because he knew resistance would only deepen the punishment. He was given a suspension notice and told his parent would be contacted. As he stepped outside to wait, the sun felt harsh against his skin, exposing him to passing students who whispered as they walked by. He sat on the steps, shoulders slumped, replaying the scene again and again, wondering how a question had turned into a consequence. He felt anger, confusion, and a quiet sadness that settled deep in his chest. Yet beneath it all was a flicker of resolve. He knew he hadn't been wrong to speak. What he couldn't know yet was that this public removal, this attempt to silence him, had triggered attention far beyond the school's walls. The suspension, lobbed so casually, had set something in motion that no one there could stop. The suspension notice didn't just disappear into a filing cabinet the way the school assumed it would. The moment Marcus's record was updated, a quiet digital ripple moved outward, passing through systems no one in the administrative office ever thought about. Long before that day, Marcus's name had already existed in places far removed from detention slips and classroom warnings. It lived in databases connected to academic competitions, youth leadership programs, and national initiatives designed to identify exceptional talent early. Years earlier, a middle school counselor had submitted his name for a federally sponsored youth debate and civic analysis program after watching him dismantle complex policy questions with clarity far beyond his age. Marcus had advanced quietly, participating in online forums, submitting essays, attending summer sessions that emphasized ethics, communication, and critical thinking. None of it felt extraordinary to him. He thought it was normal to ask hard questions, to challenge ideas respectfully, to engage deeply with the world. Those programs tracked progress meticulously, flagging sudden changes in academic standing or disciplinary action as potential red flags. When Marcus's suspension was entered into the school system, it didn't just register as a local punishment. It triggered an alert. A pattern recognition algorithm noticed the inconsistency between his long-standing academic profile and the vague disciplinary reason attached to his record. Talking too much didn't align with the behavioral markers typically associated with disciplinary escalation. Somewhere, far from the school's front office, A file was opened and reviewed by eyes trained to notice anomalies. At home, Marcus's mother received the call while she was on break at work. The principal's voice on the other end was polite but firm, explaining the suspension as a matter of classroom management. Denise listened silently, her jaw tightening with each word. She had heard this tone before, the one that framed authority as neutrality and dismissed dissent as inconvenience. When she asked what Marcus had said to warrant the suspension, the answer was vague. He was disruptive. He wouldn't stop talking, nothing specific, no mention of disrespect, no mention of refusal to follow instructions, just talking. Denise hung up and stared at the wall, something deep in her gut telling her this wasn't the full story. When Marcus got home, he handed her the notice without a word. She read it slowly, then looked at him. "What really happened?" she asked. He told her everything, his voice steady, recounting the question he'd asked, the way the room had gone quiet, the suddenness of the punishment. Denise believed him immediately. She had raised her son. She knew his tone, his respect for rules. What she didn't know yet was that his voice had been protected long before the school tried to silence it. While Denise made calls to request a meeting, emails were already being generated elsewhere. Formal inquiries sent to the district requesting clarification. The school would soon receive notices asking for documentation, justification, and records of prior incidents. But for now, everything remained quiet. Marcus spent his suspension days at home, reading, replaying the incident in his mind, wondering if he should have stayed silent. He didn't know that his silence was no longer an option, that his name now sat at the intersection of education, equity, and national attention. The system the school relied on to discipline him was about to collide with a system far larger, one that didn't see his voice as a problem, but as a resource worth protecting. Denise Reed had never been the kind of woman to accept silence when something felt wrong. The suspension notice sat on the kitchen table like an accusation. Its few typed lines doing nothing to explain why her son had been pushed out of a classroom for asking a question. She reread it again and again, searching for meaning between the words, but all she found was absence. No transcript of what was said, no explanation of how the situation had escalated so quickly, just authority asserting itself without accountability. Denise requested a meeting with the school administration the very next morning. She arrived early, dressed in her work uniform, eyes tired but sharp. The principal greeted her with a practiced smile, the kind meant to reassure without conceding anything. They spoke of policy and procedure, of classroom order and behavioral expectations. Denise listened, then calmly asked a simple question. What exactly did Marcus say that warranted suspension? The room went quiet. The answer that followed was vague, circular, unsatisfying. He disrupted instruction. He spoke out of turn. When Denise pressed for specifics, the explanations thinned. There were no quotes, no documented warnings, no escalating steps, just an assertion that the teacher felt disrespected. Denise felt the familiar frustration of being talked around instead of talked to. She pointed out Marcus's academic record, his history of participation, the lack of prior serious incidents. The administrators nodded politely, but their posture remained closed, their language defensive. The meeting ended without resolution, the suspension upheld, the matter declared settled. Outside the school, Denise sat in her car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel, anger and fear twisting together in her chest. She knew this wasn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It was about a system that assumed her son's voice was a problem before it ever tried to understand it. She went home and began making calls, not just to the school district, but to anyone who might listen. She contacted the counselor, who who had once nominated Marcus for that debate program, asking if there was anyone she should speak to. She forwarded emails, attached documents, requested reviews. She didn't know which door would open, but she refused to stop knocking. Meanwhile, responses were already forming. Requests for clarification came back faster than she expected, phrased formally, asking the school to explain the rationale behind the suspension. Denise felt a shift she couldn't yet name, a sense that the ground beneath the school's decision was not as solid as they believed. Marcus watched his mother work, saw the determination in her movements, and felt a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He hadn't wanted trouble. He hadn't wanted anyone fighting on his behalf. But he also knew that what had happened wasn't right. As days passed, Denise received a message that made her pause. It didn't explain much, only that the situation was being reviewed and that further contact might occur. She didn't know who was reviewing it or how far it reached. She only knew that someone was finally asking questions. The school, unaware of the widening circle of attention, continued as if nothing had changed. Teachers taught. Students attended. But the decision to silence Marcus had already traveled beyond their control, carried by a parent who refused to accept quiet injustice, and by systems designed to notice when something didn't add up. The morning the school changed began quietly, almost deceptively so. The parking lot filled the way it always did, buses lining up in neat rows, students spilling out with backpacks slung low, and conversations half finished. Teachers arrived with coffee cups in hand, thinking about lesson plans and grading deadlines, unaware that the rhythm of the day was already off balance. Inside the building, lockers slammed, announcements crackled over the intercom, and the hum of routine wrapped everything in a familiar sense of control. Marcus wasn't there. His desk sat empty, a small absence. No one expected to matter beyond a few whispered comments. In the administrative office, the principal reviewed emails with mild irritation, noting a few formal requests for documentation that had come in late the previous afternoon. He assumed they were standard inquiries, nothing more than paperwork to be handled later. He had no idea that the requests were only the beginning. Shortly after first period began, the front office phone rang. The secretary answered, her expression shifting from neutral to uncertain within seconds. She covered the receiver and leaned toward the principal, whispering something that made him straighten in his chair. Another call followed almost immediately, then another. Outside, an unfamiliar sound cut through the usual noise of the school day. Engines idled, doors closed softly, footsteps approached with purpose. A teacher peered through the window of her classroom and frowned. Unmarked vehicles sat near the entrance, their presence subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Students began to notice the shift as well. The way hall monitors lingered longer than usual. The way administrators moved quickly through corridors, their faces tight with concern. In the front office, the atmosphere changed from routine to tense. The principal was informed that several visitors had arrived requesting access to records and personnel. Their credentials were verified quietly, efficiently, with a seriousness that left no room for delay. Word spread in fragments, not yet clear enough to form a story, but enough to unsettle everyone who heard it. Teachers paused mid-lesson as announcements were postponed. The usual structure that governed every minute of the day began to fracture under the weight of something unplanned. Students whispered, phones tucked low beneath desks, rumors spreading faster than facts. Some said it was about funding. Others said it was about an investigation. No one said Marcus's name out loud yet, but the tension carried his absence like an unspoken question. In a small conference room near the office, administrators gathered, papers spread across the table, voices low and urgent. Emails were reread, policies referenced, timelines reconstructed. The suspension that had seemed so straightforward now felt dangerously exposed, its justification thin under scrutiny. Teachers were called out of class one by one, asked to clarify incidents, to explain decisions that had once felt routine. Mrs. Caldwell sat stiffly in her chair when it was her turn, her confidence wavering as questions became more precise. She insisted she had acted within her authority, that classroom control demanded firm action. But the tone of the conversation had shifted. Authority was no longer assumed, it was being examined. Students sensed the unease. The hallways buzzed with speculation as staff members moved with unusual urgency. A counselor quietly closed her office door, rechecking notes she hadn't thought about in years. The school, so accustomed to operating behind closed doors, suddenly felt transparent, its internal logic exposed to forces it couldn't control. By mid-morning, it was clear this was no routine visit. The presence of outside investigators, their calm insistence on answers, signaled something far larger than a disciplinary review. Somewhere between second and third period, a teacher finally said what many were thinking, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is about that boy." Marcus spent that morning at home, unaware of the unfolding tension, sitting at the kitchen table with a book open but unread. His phone buzzed with messages from classmates asking if he knew what was happening. He didn't. Denise noticed the notifications piling up, her own phone vibrating moments later with a call she hadn't expected. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, asking to confirm details, to schedule a conversation. Denise listened carefully, her pulse quickening as she realized the scope of what was happening. She glanced at Marcus, who looked back at her with quiet confusion. Whatever the school thought it could contain within its walls was now spilling outward, reshaping the day for everyone inside. And as the hours passed, it became impossible to ignore that the suspension of one student had triggered scrutiny that would change the institution itself. The arrival of the federal agents did not come with flashing lights or raised voices. It came with calm certainty, the kind that doesn't need spectacle to command attention. By the time the school's administrators fully grasped who their visitors were, the tone of the building had already shifted from uneasy to restrained. Credentials were presented quietly, badges shown only long enough to confirm authority before being tucked away again. There were no threats, no accusations yet, just requests. Requests for records, requests for timelines, requests for explanations that could no longer rely on vague language or institutional habit. The principal's office became a temporary center of controlled urgency as folders were pulled from cabinets, digital files accessed, emails forwarded. Every detail that had once seemed routine was now subject to scrutiny. The agents moved with precision, splitting their attention between documentation and people. They asked about Marcus Reed's academic history, his disciplinary record, and the specific circumstances surrounding his suspension. Each question was direct, leaving little room for interpretation. When they asked why a student with no history of defiance had been removed from class for talking too much, the silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. The explanation offered sounded hollow, even to those giving it. Words like disruption and classroom management were repeated, but they no longer carried the weight they once did. The agents listened without interruption, taking notes, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested a deeper context the school did not yet understand. In a separate room, Mrs. Caldwell sat across from two agents, her posture stiff, hands folded tightly in her lap. She repeated her account, emphasizing her years of experience and her belief in maintaining order. She insisted that Marcus's behavior had undermined her authority, that she had acted to preserve the learning environment. One agent asked her to describe verbatim what Marcus had said. She hesitated. The room grew quiet as she searched for an answer precise enough to justify the consequence. When she finally spoke, the words sounded less like disruption and more like curiosity. The agent nodded slowly, writing something down. Another asked how many warnings had been issued before the suspension. Mrs. Caldwell admitted there were none documented that day. The air in the room changed, the realization settling in that intention and impact were not the same thing, and that authority without accountability invited consequences. Meanwhile, the agents requested access to the district's internal data systems. They reviewed patterns that extended beyond Marcus's case, noting disparities in how discipline was applied, which students were flagged more often, whose voices were labeled disruptive. The school's confidence in its neutrality began to erode under the weight of data that told a different story. What had been dismissed as isolated incidents now appeared as part of a broader pattern, one that raised questions far beyond a single suspension. The agents were not there to argue ideology. They were there to assess compliance, equity, and the protection of federally recognized educational rights. Word spread through the building that this was not just a district review. Teachers whispered in hallways, students speculated openly, and administrators grew increasingly aware that the situation was out of their hands. The agents requested to speak with Marcus and his mother. When Denise arrived at the school later that afternoon, she was escorted through halls that now felt unfamiliar, every glance carrying a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She was introduced to the agents, who explained calmly why they were there, outlining concerns about the handling of Marcus's case and the broader implications. They spoke of programs Marcus had been part of protections afforded to students identified through national initiatives, of obligations schools had to ensure those students were not unfairly silenced or penalized. Denise listened, absorbing the information with a steady composure that masked the surge of emotion beneath it. Marcus sat beside her, quiet but attentive, answering questions when asked, describing the incident in his own words. His account was clear, consistent, and free of exaggeration. The agents noted his demeanor, the way he articulated his thoughts, the ease with which he explained complex ideas. This was not a child seeking attention. This was a young mind accustomed to engagement. One agent thanked him for speaking honestly, acknowledging that his voice mattered. It was the first time since the suspension that an adult in authority had said those words aloud. By the end of the day, it was clear that the school's narrative was no longer sufficient. The agents outlined next steps, requesting additional documentation and setting expectations for cooperation. They made it known, without raising their voices, that this situation would not be quietly closed. As they left the building, the sense of relief some administrators felt was quickly replaced by the understanding that accountability was only beginning. The suspension that had been issued so casually had drawn the attention of an institution designed to protect voices like Marcus's, voices that challenge systems, not through defiance, but through thought. And while the school grappled with the reality of that oversight, Marcus walked out beside his mother, aware now that speaking up had not brought him trouble alone, but visibility. And that visibility carried power the school had never anticipated. The truth did not emerge all at once. It surfaced slowly, methodically, pulled into the light by questions that refused to accept half answers. In the days following the agent's visit, the school entered a kind of suspended reality, operating outwardly as usual while internally unraveling. Emails marked urgent circulated among administrators. Meetings were scheduled, rescheduled, and held behind closed doors. Requests for documentation expanded, no longer limited to Marcus Reed's suspension, but reaching back years into disciplinary records that had never been questioned before. Patterns began to appear, uncomfortable and undeniable. The same kinds of infractions, interpreted differently depending on who committed them. The same language repeated in reports, vague yet damning, used disproportionately to describe students whose curiosity did not conform to expectations. Mrs. Ubler first. Caldwell was placed on administrative leave pending further review, a decision announced quietly but felt loudly throughout the faculty. Some teachers reacted with disbelief, others with guarded relief. Conversations in staff lounges shifted tone, moving from defensiveness to introspection. For the first time, many were forced to confront how easily bias could hide behind policy, how authority could be exercised without reflection. The school district issued a statement acknowledging the investigation, emphasizing cooperation and a commitment to fairness. It was carefully worded, but the message was clear. The situation was serious. Marcus's suspension was formally rescinded. The notation was removed from his record, replaced with language acknowledging procedural error. But the correction felt small compared to the weight of what had been exposed. Administrators were required to explain, in detail, how a student had been removed from class without documented warnings or due process. They struggled to justify decisions that had once seemed routine. Data reviewed by the agents highlighted disparities that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The narrative shifted from one student's behavior to institutional practice, from individual authority to systemic accountability. Students noticed the change immediately. Assemblies were called. Counselors spoke openly about voice, respect, and the importance of speaking up. For many students, especially those who had learned to stay quiet to avoid trouble, the sudden emphasis on dialogue felt both validating and unsettling. Marcus returned to school under a cloud of attention he hadn't asked for. Some classmates treated him like a hero, others avoided him, unsure how to navigate the new dynamic. He kept his head down, focusing on his work, aware that his presence now carried meaning beyond his intentions. The agents continued their review, extending their focus to district-level policies and training practices. Recommendations were issued, some immediate, others long-term. Mandatory bias training was scheduled. Disciplinary guidelines were revised to require clearer documentation and oversight. The school board faced public questions at meetings that drew larger crowds than usual. Parents demanded transparency. Community members spoke about experiences they had never felt safe sharing before. The story of a student suspended for talking too much had opened a door many realized had been locked for years. For Marcus, the truth brought mixed emotions. There was relief in knowing he had been right to speak, that the system had acknowledged its mistake. But there was also a heaviness, an awareness that his experience was not unique. He listened as adults discussed policy and reform, wondering how many other voices had been silenced without anyone noticing. His mother stayed close, proud of his composure, determined to ensure that change was not temporary. Together, they watched as the school tried to reconcile its self-image with the reality now laid bare. The investigation did not end with punishment alone. It ended with exposure. Exposure of assumptions, exposure of habits, exposure of a truth the school could no longer ignore. That silencing curiosity under the guise of order did more than discipline a student. It revealed a system in need of change. And while the process was uncomfortable, even painful, it marked a turning point. What began as an attempt to quiet one voice had instead amplified many, forcing an institution to confront itself in a way it never had before. When Marcus Reed was asked to speak again, it wasn't in a classroom where his voice had once been treated as a problem. It was in a room filled with administrators, teachers, counselors, and members of the district leadership, all seated and waiting. The setting alone signaled that something had changed. Marcus stood at the front, hands steady at his sides, his posture calm. He wasn't there to accuse or to defend himself. He was there because, for the first time, the system wanted to listen. He began by describing the day of his suspension, not with anger, but with clarity. He spoke about raising his hand, about wanting to understand the lesson, about the confusion he felt when a question turned into a punishment. His voice did not waver. He explained how being told he talked too much felt less like feedback and more like a judgment on who he was. As he spoke, the room remained silent, the kind of silence that comes not from control, but from attention. Marcus shifted from his own experience to a broader reflection. He talked about curiosity, about how learning depends on dialogue, about how students are taught to think critically, but are often discouraged from expressing those thoughts. He spoke about the difference between disruption and engagement, about how easily one can be mistaken for the other when authority feels challenged. He didn't mention race explicitly, but it hung in the air, understood by everyone present. His words carried weight because they were not rehearsed for effect. They came from lived experience, from a place of sincerity that made defensiveness impossible. When he finished, there was a pause. Then the principal spoke, acknowledging that the school had failed to uphold its own values. An apology followed, not just to Marcus, but to students who had been silenced in similar ways. It was imperfect, careful, but it was real. Teachers asked questions, not to justify themselves, but to understand how they could do better. Marcus answered thoughtfully, emphasizing the importance of communication, of asking before assuming, of recognizing that respect goes both ways. He wasn't trying to teach them a lesson, but in that moment, he was. News of the meeting spread quickly. Students talked about it in hallways. Parents shared it in community groups. And the narrative shifted from controversy to possibility. Marcus's willingness to speak, even after being punished for it, became a symbol of resilience. He returned to his classes with a new awareness, careful not to let the attention change who he was. He still raised his hand. He still asked questions. But now when he spoke, there was space for his voice, an acknowledgement that his presence added value rather than disruption. The experience reshaped his understanding of power. He learned that systems could be challenged not only by resistance, but by articulation. That calm truth could carry further than anger. That speaking up, even when it cost something, could create openings for change. His classmates watched, some inspired, others cautious, but all aware that something fundamental had shifted. The classroom was no longer just a place of instruction. It was a place where dialogue had reclaimed its purpose. And Marcus, once suspended for talking too much, had shown that the very act of speaking could transform the spaces that tried to contain it. The changes that followed did not arrive overnight, but they arrived with intention. In the weeks after Marcus spoke, The school entered a period of re-evaluation that reached far beyond the incident that had sparked it. Policies were reviewed line by line, not just to satisfy external oversight, but because the cracks had become impossible to ignore. Disciplinary procedures were rewritten to require context, documentation, and multiple perspectives before consequences could be issued. Administrators who had once relied on habit were now required to justify decisions with clarity. Teachers attended training sessions that went beyond checklists, sessions that forced uncomfortable conversations about implicit bias, authority, and the difference between control and respect. Some resisted quietly, others leaned in, but no one could pretend the old ways were sufficient anymore. The school board faced public scrutiny as parents demanded accountability and transparency. Meetings grew crowded, voices once hesitant, now steady as they shared experiences that mirrored Marcus's. Stories emerged of students disciplined for curiosity, for questioning, for refusing to shrink themselves to fit narrow expectations. The district responded by creating channels for student feedback, advisory councils, where voices like Marcus's were not only allowed but invited. Counselors were trained to identify when disciplinary action masked deeper issues of equity, and administrators were required to report data on discipline broken down by race, gender, and behavior type. Numbers replaced assumptions, and the picture they painted was sobering. Marcus continued his education under this evolving system, aware that his presence had helped catalyze change, but careful not to let it define him entirely. He joined debate competitions again, his confidence sharpened by experience rather than shaken by it. Opportunities followed, invitations to speak at youth forums, to participate in programs that valued his insight. Yet he remained grounded, still the same student who loved history and language, still driven by questions rather than recognition. His mother watched with quiet pride as doors opened that once seemed distant, knowing that his journey had not been easy but had been necessary. The school itself began to shift in subtle ways. Classrooms grew louder, not with chaos, but with discussion. Teachers learned to pause instead of react, to ask rather than assume. Students who had learned to stay silent began to test their voices, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The culture of compliance softened, replaced by one that recognized engagement as a strength rather than a threat. Mistakes were still made, but they were addressed openly with a willingness to learn rather than punish. What had started as a suspension became a catalyst for institutional reflection. The investigation's recommendations were implemented, not as temporary fixes, but as long-term commitments. Annual reviews ensured that progress did not fade with time. The school partnered with community organizations to foster dialogue about equity and education, extending the impact beyond its walls. Marcus's story became part of training materials, not as a cautionary tale about discipline, but as a reminder of the cost of silencing voices that matter. In the end, the aftermath was not defined by who was punished, but by what was rebuilt. Trust, once fractured, began to mend. Students learned that their voices could shape their environment. Educators learned that authority carried responsibility as well as power. And the school, changed by the scrutiny it never expected, moved forward with a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly educate. The legacy of what happened at that school did not live in reports or policy documents alone. It lived in moments that followed, quiet moments that might have gone unnoticed if not for the shift they represented. A student raising a hand without fear. A teacher pausing before responding, choosing curiosity over control. a classroom where questions no longer felt dangerous. Marcus Reed's story became more than a headline or a lesson in accountability. It became a reminder of something simple and powerful, that voices are not problems to be managed, but signals to be understood. When systems punish curiosity, they don't just discipline individuals, they dim collective potential. And when those systems are challenged, even unintentionally, they are forced to remember their purpose. Marcus never set out to change an institution. He only wanted to learn, to understand, to engage with the world honestly. But history has always moved forward on the backs of people who refused to be silent when silence was easier. His experience showed that injustice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes disguised as routine, as policy, as a quiet note entered into a system. And it persists not because it is right, but because it goes unchallenged. What made the difference in Marcus's case was not just federal attention or procedural review. It was a refusal to accept that being heard was a flaw. It was a parent who trusted her instincts, a student who spoke with clarity instead of rage, and a moment when authority was finally willing to listen. The story also carried a warning. For every Marcus whose voice is eventually protected, there are countless others whose questions never trigger alarms, whose suspensions never reach beyond school walls, whose silence becomes permanent. Change does not happen because one system is exposed. It happens when awareness becomes habit, when listening becomes practice, and when educators, administrators, and communities commit to seeing engagement as strength rather than disruption. Education, at its best, is not about obedience. It is about empowerment. As Marcus moved forward, his future no longer defined by a suspension that never should have happened, he carried the lesson with him. That speaking up matters, even when it costs something. That calm truth can unsettle power more effectively than anger, and that the courage to ask questions is often the first step toward meaningful change. His voice, once labeled too much, had proven to be exactly what the moment required. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a time when your voice was questioned or ignored, take a moment to reflect on how many stories like this remain unheard. Share this video so others can listen. Like it to help this message reach further. And subscribe to this channel for more real stories that challenge silence, expose injustice, and remind us why voices matter. Because the world does not change when people stop talking. It changes when someone refuses to be quiet.